Hi, good evening. Welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. Now then, with the corporate media in lockstep with the NATO war machine's proxy war in Ukraine and its subservience to the Zionist propaganda about the genocide Israel's inflicting on Gaza, there's never been a more important time for independent journalists. So I'm particularly pleased to welcome Warren Thornton onto the show tonight. Warren served in the military for 6 years and also worked protecting aid workers in many war-torn countries for 8 years, and he's gained a reputation as an independent journalist. And I was pleased to share a platform with Warren at the weekend in Bristol. That was a meeting hosted by the No to NATO, No to War campaign. And Warren made an outstanding contribution at that meeting. So we're very pleased to have you, Warren. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. Tell us a little bit of, good. I was just going to say, just tell us a bit about, how you, because you've had a really amazing history there. So tell us a bit about, how you got into journalism, first of all, if you could, and, your sort of, some of your great trophies, some of the things that you've broken, which are pretty amazing.
Yeah, I sort of got into it because of my past and what I'd done. I made very, very good contacts in not only the military, but also embassy workers, because you bump into attaches, you get aid workers as well. And people started phoning me up a couple of years ago and saying, Warren, you won't believe what's going on, but we can't speak out about it, would you? So I thought I needed some protection. So I enrolled myself as in a course and became a journalistic member. And then I started just a little TikTok account telling everything that people were saying to me. And I had what you might call fantastic sources because they were so close to all the things that were going on. And then I turned around and I said, I'm really, really sorry that, your word is not getting out there. So we started getting maybe 15 or 20 people to start with. I thought I'd be talking to. And in no time, it became 20,000 and then it became 40,000. And now I think it's up to something like 72,500.
Yeah.
So it was very, very, very strange. But I've only been at it for 2 years. But the simple fact is on the platform, we just tell the truth, the facts, what we know. We don't go with conspiracy theories, but the facts enough are alarming as they are, Chris.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just wonder what your thoughts were, Warren, about the way in which the media reporters in war-torn countries, this sort of process of being embedded, like we saw in Iraq. The corporate media hacks were embedded with the US military or the British military. We're seeing a similar thing now with some of the reporters from the corporate media embedding themselves with the Israeli occupation forces in their genocide against Gaza. And my sense is that leads to an even greater extent a sort of skewed perspective, because inevitably, I suppose, when you are embedded with a group of soldiers, you kind of form a bond, a relationship. And I just wonder what your thoughts were, whether that's going to then impinge on their impartiality. And we know that, where the corporate media is coming from anyway, they've got an agenda. But do you think that is a good or a bad thing, embedding, being embedded with a particular military in a war situation, or not?
No, it's an absolutely terrible thing, Chris. And here's the reason why. I have many independent journalist friends who can't get their stories out. Because what happens now is, back in the day, just very quickly go into this, back in the day you had war photographers like Kappa and the great Don McCullin. And they would report on the Vietnam War, and basically the powers that be and the press would say, this is happening. And suddenly Don McCullin's newspaper, photos in the newspaper would hit the American breakfast tables. And this is what kicked off the Great American. In fact, he was probably one of the very best at actually bringing the war to an end, because his photographs are absolutely legendary. And they were at direct odds with what they were being told by the media and what they were being told by the government. And when you embed someone in there now, what generally tends to happen is they go somewhere after it's calmed down and it's fairly safe, and you're being guided as to what you need to see, and you cannot get right on the front line most of the time. How can I put this? Many independent journalists I know get shot at. I mean, you've only got to look at the Ukraine war. If you dare to say anything against the narrative and that is not Russia-phobic, if you like, you straight away, they have a website, the Ukrainians, called Militovets, which is a Ukrainian kill list, which they killed many journalists already. I think they killed 16 before 2022, and they killed quite a few afterwards. In fact, they went after one, what you might call journalist, Tartaski, blew him up in a cafe in St. Petersburg. And they went after another one called Dugan, and they missed him and blew up the car with his daughter in. So there's an inherent danger about being a journalist, and aid workers should always be completely and utterly impartial and just report what you see. And to be honest, Chris, just to finish up, I think in the old days, the media used to hold the government to account and the government hold the media to account. And that sort of, it was a fairer system than now. Now you have the governments and mainstream media walking in lockstep. And I think that's why we've become so popular as journalists, because we actually tell the truth and people are thirsting for that.
No, indeed. I mean, I think your point about the Vietnam War is well made, because in the early days of the first several years, as I understand it, of the war in Vietnam, there was a lot of support actually in the United States from the general public, and the early protesters really were sort of almost taking their lives in their hands, sometimes literally taking their lives in their hands by speaking out. But because of these brave, groundbreaking journalists doing what journalists, ought to be doing, that helped to sort of change public opinion, didn't it? When people could see the reality of what was happening. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would do very much so. And you were saying about people taking lives in their hands. I mean, one was Jane Fonda, who was called Hanoi Jane, just for speaking out against the American war machine that was obviously causing such havoc. And then, of course, didn't we had that amazing photograph, that horrible photograph of that young naked girl running along the road, having been burnt with napalm. And suddenly something went off in the public consciousness, that we are not being told what is right here. And the youth of that day were much more politically engaged and all came out and started really causing problems on campuses. And it needs that today, because we have so many distractions, and young people should be into what is going on in the world and they should care about it deeply, but they should be able to get the complete picture and not just the sanitized version.
No, indeed. I mean, and again, just talking about some of the risks that the journalists take, and you mentioned the risks, particularly in relation to NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, that journalists take if they, as it were, stray from the narrative. There was a British journalist, and his name escapes me at the moment. You may know him, Warren, or you may know his name, but he's been effectively sanctioned by the British government. He's had his property apparently has been confiscated. I mean, he's over in the Donbass.
Graham Phillips.
But I mean, it's shocking, isn't it? I mean, just say a little bit about that, Warren, because I suspect a lot of people aren't aware of it. Just tell the viewers about what's happened to him.
Yeah, I mean, we have Graham Phillips, who had all his bank accounts shut down, and he's literally been made an enemy of the state for simply turning around and saying what happened in Donbass. Now, himself and Patrick Lancaster were very groundbreaking indeed. But there was an even earlier one who really suffered in France, a woman called Anne-Laure Bonnel. And she was one of the in fact, she did a documentary called The Donbass, which showed all these horrific war crimes that these Azov battalion neo-Nazi lunatics were committing on civilians. And for 9 years, she tried to get French TV to take up, this wonderful body of work that she did. And she was ostracized by many, many people, as indeed Graham Phillips is now. And even when you go on to, Graham Phillips has a channel on Telegram, and even when you go on that channel, you see so many people on there just giving him abuse, and all he's doing is just saying what's going on. And if it doesn't fit the narrative, I mean, obviously in this day of bots and AI and stuff like that, you have a group of people out there, Chris, called NAFO.
Yes, we are familiar with them.
Yeah,
I've been targeted by them.
Yes, exactly that. And what they do is they even, while the conference was going on, when Victoria Nuland went over there to have a conference, they even had their own conference going on where they all stood up, and there were people going on with pet crocodiles, and these guys just had sort of no life whatsoever. But they were bragging how they had like hundreds of accounts, and from those hundreds of accounts they would have another 50, 60 accounts off of those, and they would just flood the internet. And even today on Twitter, they get things trending. You see all the time, Russia is losing, Russia is a terrorist, and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
the same's happening with Palestine.
Of course. I mean, and talking about Twitter and trending, Sean was saying just before we went on air that apparently I'm trending on Twitter today because of an interview I gave to Julia Hartley Brewer about the situation in Gaza. So certainly that's the downside, I suppose, of social media. But one of the things I was going to say, though, is that I'm thinking in particular now in relation to Palestine and Gaza, because obviously, history didn't start on October the 7th. And I think people have been increasingly aware of the horrors of the Zionist entity's brutality towards the Palestinian people. Thanks to social media, thanks to citizen journalists on the ground actually, being able to bring the reality of the occupation to people's attention in terms of what's happening what's been happening now in the West Bank. I mean, the last I heard, I think it was over 150 people had been killed in the West Bank. But also, things like, the house demolitions, the acquisitions, people being thrown out, Palestinian people who, as we know, live for kind of, dozens and dozens of generations are being thrown out of their home, thrown out of their land. Their ability to farm is being impinged, where the settlers, the illegal settlers, are coming and cutting their olive trees down, pouring concrete into wells. It's quite unbelievable. So there's that type of brutality, as well as the real very heavy duty violence that the Palestinian people are being subjected to. And so a lot more people are aware of that. However, when I went on this interview with Julia Hartley Brewer today, I mean, she was very much peddling the kind of the Zionist line, the propaganda. It's, Hamas, are evil, savage terrorists. This is all about, Israel kind of defending itself and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think there is an upside, isn't there, to the social media. So what's your thoughts about the way in which, citizen journalists in Palestine and indeed, elsewhere, I mean, what role do you think they can play in actually, telling the truth to a wider general public?
Well, I think they have a massive role to play in the fact that these people who are not journalists, and I would really like to say that I think there's no such thing. Mainstream journalists now are actually, they don't give you proper news, they give you propaganda, and that's a real problem. In the citizen journalist will just photograph what's going on, and he'll put it out there. And I would say they're more of a journalist than the journalists are nowadays, for the simple fact mainstream media just goes along with whatever the guy at the very top is saying. Then the editor tells them that's exactly the line they're taking. Take, for instance, you today, Julia Hartley Brewer. I haven't even seen it, and I know that Julia Hartley Brewer will be pushing a narrative that will be totally against yours. And her job as a broadcaster, as an interviewer, is to listen to what you've got to say, not to keep shouting it down, but to actually ask you questions about why you think that, and then leave it open for people to decide for themselves. It's always a thing, Chris. If you don't get both sides of the argument, there isn't a debate. And when you can't debate anything, what you've got is an autocracy, really. And the thing that really gets me is the amount of people who've never been on the front line in their lives. I remember speaking out quite harshly when I was in Panama looking after aid workers there, and the amount of lunatics that were roaming around, beating people up with clubs and stuff like that, was quite sickening. In America, we're actually backing this. It was really, really bad. And there are many other places where I've been where it's been appalling. El Salvador and all various places like that. And it's a real problem, even keeping aid workers safe, because these guys have suddenly got power. They're not the most stable people in the world. You've only got to look at Ukraine. And if you look at Israel, for instance, I put out 3 or 4 videos stating something that's completely true, which is the Hannibal Directive. And we even had the woman in the kibbutz who was actually there and witnessed tanks being rolled forward, Hamas terrorists and Israeli, should we say, hostages, all in the same building, didn't even try to negotiate, just flattened the buildings and killed the Israelis in there. And that's happened on many, many occasions. Now, I don't care, Chris, what flag you stand under, whether you stand under a Hamas flag, whether you're on the Israeli side. If you kill a child and you target children and civilians on purpose, you're a war criminal. I don't care how much right you may think you have. You have no right to slaughter civilians whatsoever.
No, indeed. I mean, the Hannibal Directive, we've covered this on Palestine Declassified, the program that I host, and this is the directive which basically stipulates that the Israeli military are effectively instructed, really, to ensure that, hostages, prisoners are not taken, even if that means killing their own people. And, most of the people, many certainly anyway, of the people that were killed on October 7th, when there was the resistance fighters' incursion into Palestine, were actually killed by the Israelis' own forces. They knew, as you say, they knew that their own people were in those buildings, and furthermore, when some of the people were being driven away, there were airstrikes on them. And then this, of course, was then portrayed as if this had all been done by Hamas, which was obviously not the case. But just in terms of the situation in Gaza at the moment, and just looking at the risks being taken by journalists. I mean, I think I saw something on Al Jazeera today, and I must pay tribute to Al Jazeera because I think their coverage, I don't know if you've been watching any of it,
yes.
Warren, but I think their coverage has been outstanding of what, I mean, it's totally different to what I can barely watch the BBC. I do try and turn it on and listen to Radio 4 at times, but oh my God, it's just kind of wall to wall propaganda. But Al Jazeera, really does give a very, honest and on the ground, reportage saying how it is. And those reporters that are doing that, I mean, I think all of them actually are from Gaza as well, but 39, as I understand it, have been killed. This is unprecedented, apparently, in war situations. I can't remember. You might know this. Warren, in terms of the number of journalists that were killed during the Vietnam War, which went on for the best part of 20 years, didn't it? I think it's about 60 odd or so. But 39 in 3 weeks is quite unprecedented, isn't it?
Well, it's unprecedented because they're targeting the reporters because they don't want the news getting out there. So what they do is they wait for the live report to come out. They find exactly where that person is, and then they target them and they bomb that area. And that has happened, especially in the hospitals, where there's been journalists there, and journalists who, there was a young lady journalist, trying to think of her name. She literally gave a report live on air, and within, I think it was something like 25 minutes, she was hit in a strike. That is not a coincidence. They are targeting anybody that's trying to get the truth out there, as they do also on media. I mean, you only have to look at the amount of people who are putting out what's going on and being shut down, and if they can't shut them down, like yourself, then they invite them on TV programs and try to eviscerate them. But the trouble is they don't discuss, they shout at people because they can't get the point.
No, indeed. And you're right as well that the point you was making earlier, Warren, about the the abuse that the NAFO trolls and others. I mean, I've been referred to as the Ayatollah's bitch, a rape apologist, because I said that Russell Brand deserved due process and that
Yes.
he'd been the subject of a hit job, a 4-year hit job by Murdoch, and it's rather coincidental not that. I mean, I was never a particular fan of his comedy, I've got to say, but of late with his podcast that he's been putting out, he's been really holding the military-industrial complex to account, big pharma to account, the corporate capitalism. He's been shining a light on these abuses, and he has a big following, and and then there's suddenly these accusations after a 4-year trawling for trying to find people to make accusations against the Chemical 4 people. But I was saying, look, well, one, it's a it's Murdoch. It looks like a hit job to me, and surely he's entitled to due process, isn't he? But that was seen as beyond the pale, and I was then persona non grata. And what was disappointing about that was that even I mean, there were a lot of trolls, but there were even some people who I think ought to know better, on the left who were joining in that. I mean, I find that very frustrating. And about you, Warren, I mean, what's your thoughts about sometimes people you would think would have a better kind of political understanding and a notion of what's right, what's fair, and due process, etc. And then suddenly they jump in on the bandwagon.
Well, you can't have trial by media. I mean, obviously, if there are pictures, when you looked at someone like Mason Greenwood, for instance, the video evidence was out there for everybody to see, and we knew that that was the gentleman who was actually speaking. So, in that case, there's not a lot to. But what you do when you have trial by media, you make it almost impossible for them to have a fair hearing in a court of law. Now, Russell Brand, the left are going crazy and this, that, and the other. But for years and years and years, if that behaviour was prevalent, they were perfectly okay with it until he started speaking out against the military-industrial complex. And if you ever notice, the same with Julian Assange, if they can't get you as an anti-Semite, they'll try and get you on some sort of sex predator charge, like Assange with Sweden, and then suddenly Russell Brand. It's the Murdoch playbook out again. It starts with. It starts first of all to say you're a dangerous conspiracy theorist. Then it goes on to you're an anti-Semite is the one they try and get you, or a racist, or whichever one they can do. And then finally, if they can't do that, then they try and drag up some sort of person who, shall we say, in the dim, distant past, may have had a bit of a fling with you and is pretty upset and decides that they want to be famous. I'm always worried. When in, say, for the case of Russell Brand, you have a woman who's turning around and saying he did this to me to Channel 4 and find out that she's now working for Channel 4. Yeah.
These sorts of accusations are very difficult to get from underneath as well, even when you sort of prove yourself through a court of law, as innocent as it were. I mean, I never went to a court of law, obviously, but I'm still often referenced as some sort of, raving anti-Semite, some sort of bigot, racist, etc. When I've spent my life fighting racism and literally fighting racists on the street in the 1970s as one of the very first members of the anti-Nazi League. And yet and it's like today when I was on with, again, just come back to Julia Holly-Brewer, she said, why don't you just come on, Chris, and just say, I hate all Jews? It's quite shocking, that people are able to get away with that. But you mentioned Julian Assange there, Warren, and I mean, one of the things I've been really shocked by, I shouldn't be really, but I am still, that the journalists, the corporate media hacks have, not only have they not come to Julian's defence, they've actually, taken the opportunity to kick a man when he's down, to ridicule him and all the rest of it. What's your thoughts about those journalists who have done that? And I mean, just say a word or two, if you could, about Julian's situation as well.
Yeah, I mean, currently residing in Belmarsh, and as you know, I had a little taste of being grabbed hold of at one point for exposing the Canadian the Nazi in the Canadian Parliament and exposing.
Yes. Oh, it's going to come on to that actually, but yes, let's come back to that in a minute. Actually, yeah.
And I had a bit of fun there, so I thoroughly understand where Julian's coming from. And Julian Assange was one of those. It's not like he told lies, Chris. He came out and he put into the public domain things that they wanted to keep very, very quiet, that they were up to. And when you come to people like it was silly people like Julia Hartley-Brewer turning around to you and said, "Why don't you say you hate all Jews?" You know, you could just turn around and go, "Julia, why don't you just say you hate all Palestinians or all Muslims?"
Yeah.
You know, it's a really facetious argument. What they want to do, Chris, is put you in boxes. So first of all, you know, what they'll do is they'll go black or white, and then they'll go old or young, then they'll go on your sexual orientation. And what they do then is they put you into a box. So you're supporting Palestine, so you must be an anti-Semite. So we'll put him in that box. Because if the media come after you as a singular person, they look like terrible, terrible bullies. Whereas if they can put you in that group, in that box, it's much easier for them to go and attack. And that's what they do all the time. You will hear, you won't hear former MP or MP Chris Williamson. You'll hear far left or anti-Semite and it's the same with, you know, Warren Thornton. Sometimes I get, Russian apologist or Putin lover. There was
Putin apologist, yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. And you're just like, you know, they will always stick that epithet in front of you. And it's absolute nonsense because they have to put you in that box. Otherwise, they're not able to have a go at you because they need you in that box, because having a go at an individual. And this is also the terrible thing. When you put a group ahead of the individual, that's always a bad sign, and we're well on the way. Julian Assange is just one of the horrible things. We still have a guy in Ukraine, Gonzalo Lira, who was arrested.
Yes, Gonzalo. Yes,
who has, you know, no doubt been tortured quite grievously. And you see the state of Julian Assange now. I believe Tucker Carlson went to see him a couple of days ago or about a week ago. But we shouldn't be locking these journalists up because they are doing what they're supposed to do. These Julian Assange and people like that are the John Pilgers of today. You know?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's quite shameful what's being done to Julian Assange. Not a single piece of information that he's ever put into the public domain has had to be corrected. Everything's been 100% correct. And what's sickening is that, you know, newspaper outlets like The Guardian and so on used Julian to sell copy, no doubt, to sell papers, and then they turned on him. I mean, it's
I mean, I'm not being funny, Chris, but when you sell your soul as a journalist like that, a journalist should pursue the stories that scare him to death, because that's your job, is to bring the news, and no matter how shocking it may be, is to get the truth out there. And really, the people who call themselves mainstream media journalists now should be ashamed.
You know, you just mentioned John Pilger. I mean, he's one of my heroes, actually. I remember as a lad, you know, watching him on the, I think it was on ITV, actually. And there were a number of, you know, really good reporters around then. I mean, obviously the Vietnam War was going on and so on.
Yeah.
But, well, those sorts of people don't seem to get a platform anymore. But I just wondered, have you got a theory or what's your thoughts on when and why did it all go so badly wrong? Because, you know, the mainstream media, I guess, is always, or maybe it's me through rose-tinted spectacles, I don't know, but yeah, I guess the mainstream media's always had an agenda, I'm pretty sure. I mean, now we've got alternative sources of information, so we can sort of fact check a lot of the nonsense that we're being told. But my sense is, as a lad growing up, you know, and into the 70s, that, you know, the reportage on the mainstream media, you know, was much more balanced. And as you say, you know, had great heroes like, you know, John Pilger on the mainstream, actually in pretty much peak time as well, speaking. And so just, what's your thoughts? I mean, do you have a theory about when and why it went so wrong?
Yes, absolutely. There is a wonderful, wonderful film made in 1976 called Network with Peter Finch.
Yes.
On this wonderful film, he does a monologue to camera where he says less than 3% of people read books, and he said you don't know anything that doesn't come out of this tube. That, you know, and then he goes on to the fact that when some of the largest corporations in the world own the greatest propaganda machine ever made. God help us, because he turned around and said, we will tell you anything you want to hear. And 9 times out of 10, he said, you'll think like the tube, you'll act like the tube, you'll name your children after what the tube tell you. And the trouble is here, when you have the people at the very top, the conglomerates, and the people who are the head of those conglomerates, they own, should we say, I think it's 92% of the media, the top 8 media moguls own. And they can construct the narrative, which is exactly what they do. They tell the editors then tell journalists. The editor will lose his job if he doesn't do what he says, as will the journalist if he doesn't do what the editor says. So they all march in time together. Many years ago, that's why Don McCullin quit war photography around about the mid-80s, because he said the landscape was changing completely. And he said, I was sending copy into the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail, and they were saying, no, thank you.
Yeah. It's shocking, really. And I wonder whether you might say a word or two as well about D-notices, Warren, because we understand that a D-notice has been issued to media outlets to suppress information about the SES role. I mean, there's speculation that they are engaged in Gaza, assisting. We also know, I think, that the British intelligence services are passing on intercepted messaging that the Palestinian resistance is doing between it, passing that on to the Israeli occupation forces. But let's talk about the SAS, the Special Air Services involvement on the ground, and this D-notice that's been issued to suppress the media from saying anything about what the SAS is up to. We can't, I don't think, definitely confirm that they're on the ground in Gaza, but just say a bit about go on then. Yeah, say a bit about D-notice and what you know about that as well, then, if you could. Then
so a D-notice is issued. The D-notice is issued. One was issued one story I broke when a command and control center, NATO command and control center, got hit just outside of Lvov. And in fact, there was one the other day, which was a training center, a NATO training center, and they couldn't keep the lid on that one. But a D-notice was issued way back in March when Russia, as retaliation for some really appalling strikes on civilians, hit a NATO command and control center outside of Lvov, and very quickly they got the barriers round and everything else, very much like Lahaina, where they got the barriers round and kept everybody away, and nobody was allowed to go in and see what was going on. The D-notice is just issued, and it is then against the national interest, or may harm anyone that reports on this. It may cause harm to the interests of the soldiers or the people that are there. And is not deemed in the national interest, and is therefore, as a journalist, you're not allowed to talk about people who are going around blowing up things in tunnels in Gaza and sort of things like that. I can absolutely 100% confirm that not only are the SAS in Gaza, but there's other British military units there too, but we can't talk about what they're doing. We can talk about that they're there. But this is the sort of thing. One thing they can't turn around and ban you from knowing, Chris, is before the Ukraine war, we had there's a thing called the Deploy de Lune, which is a French naval spy intelligence ship, and that was hovering around Ukraine as early as 2019. And just has returned from the Eastern Med, would you believe, after going walkabout. It was said that it was in dock for 2 years to be repaired, and it actually wasn't. It was in the Sea of Japan, and because I have a source in French military intelligence, and I can tell you that ship was parked in the Eastern Med for 4 months gathering intelligence before this kicked off. Right.
Interesting. Well, listen, just before we bring Sean in, just to see what reaction we've had to our conversation, I wonder whether you can maybe just finish off with the something you alluded to earlier in our conversation about the Nazi or the ex-Nazi being venerated in Canada. So say a bit about that, mate, and how you exposed all that, because that's really interesting.
Yes, well, basically, what I was doing what any mainstream journalist should be doing. I saw this guy stand up and get standing ovation. He's Ukrainian. He fought against Russia in the war. He's 98 years of age. Well, hang on a moment. The Ukrainians who fought against Russia in the war, most of them were in the 14th Brigade of the Waffen SS. So I went and dug into his past and found out that he'd actually got his own little channel where he got lots of pictures of himself in Nazi SS uniform and stuff like that. Then I went and found out exactly what his brigade did. And then I found out that he'd actually got a scholarship at Alberta University in his name. So I dug a bit further and found that when he sat on the front row, he sat with his son called Martin Hunker, who was the chief financial officer for Redpath Mining, which is one of the biggest companies, mining companies in Canada. And the two Secret Service guys were sitting next to him. So there was no doubt whatsoever that Freeland, Trudeau, and indeed Gould, who were the three people who had to know what was going on there, were all aware, because there's no way that you would let two guys sit on the front bench next to two top military experts. And one of them was the Deputy Commissioner of the Canadian Royal Mounted Police. And next to him were two Secret Service guys. And you're telling me they didn't know exactly who was sitting right next to them. You can always tell the Secret Service guys in the Canadian Parliament they don't wear ties when they go in there.
Is that right? Yeah.
And they probably will now. The thing was, I then exposed that Yaroslav Hunker's son, Martin Hunker, had made massive campaign donations to Rota, who was the Speaker of the House. Now, Rota's from his district. Now, the first thing you do, as you know, Chris, as an MP, you always have a little look at who's donating to your potential cause, for the simple fact you don't want it to come back and bite you in the backside.
No, of course.
At a later date. And then I was able to show that he had taken these campaign funds from Rota, and that Rota had taken these campaign funds from this mining company. And indeed, the local high school was, because a lot of Ukrainian and Italian, shall we say, Mussoliniites and very Banderites went and settled in that part of North Bay. And the high school was actually done on two occasions. Before soccer matches or football matches, they were throwing up Nazi salutes. So it wasn't like this was, but the mainstream media should have been all over us. I was able to dig all this up inside 4 hours and put it out there. And then, of course, on the Sunday, tap, tap, tap on the door while I was on a live to a guy from Donbass who was showing me shelling of the civilians by Ukraine. And suddenly they came along and picked me up, and they wanted to hold me.
Yeah, outrageous. Say a bit about that then as well, Warren, because that's quite incredible, really.
Yeah, I was talking, as I say, I was talking to a guy from the Donbass. I was on a live on Telegram. I just popped down. Two people were talking, Fiona Ryan and this Cafe Revolution. I just popped down to make a coffee, went to pop something out in the bin. Next thing, two gentlemen approached me and said, "We'd like to have a word with you." I was able to text the word over to Fiona just to say police. And they asked me to go with them. And I said, well, no, I'm in the middle of a live. So then I was arrested. And then I was taken to a police station where I sort of spent most of the time singing freedom songs while I was in the cells overnight. And the next morning I was pulled in for questioning, but they sort of jumped the gun a little bit. Because I quoted Article 38 of the UN Charter at them, in the fact that we'd used acts of aggression, and under journalistic license, it was my duty as a journalist to expose to the public when they were being misled by a organisation or by a public person, which they clearly were. By the fact that they hid the fact that this guy was a Nazi, and they knew.
Yes.
So they held me, and then they were going to give me a caution. And my solicitor just turned around and said, well, you're either charging him or you're letting him go because he's not accepting the caution. They went outside. They had a little chat for about 2 minutes, and then they let me go. But he really did look as though he was a bit amateurish, because the cyber crimes unit, or the cyber unit, sort of works independently from all the actual, shall we say, county constabularies. It's more or less a mishmash of lots of different people, and half the time the police don't know what they're up to. So it's almost like a very sort of sinister thing where they
very much so. Yeah. What were the on what grounds were they arresting you? What were they claiming, that what law you'd allegedly broken then?
Well, malinformation. Now there's three different types of information. Not under the new law. There's obviously the new law that's coming in. But you've got disinformation, which is when you know it to be false and you broadcast it. You've got misinformation, which is when you don't know it's false and you broadcast it. But malinformation is when you have the correct information, but they do not want it going from the private sphere into the public sphere. Therefore, it could be malicious and could be harmful and could endanger anyone. Well, the only person it could have endangered was Trudeau and obviously his crony, in the parliament. That was the only person he could ever endanger. So they didn't really have a leg to stand on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it's really sinister, though, that you were treated like that. I mean, I guess a lot of people watching today will be absolutely shocked by it. I mean, we know things are bad, but that you were treated that way. I mean, it's just quite astonishing how far we've fallen.
Yeah.
And we really do need to be more vigilant, I think, people, because Warren, a few days ago or whenever it was, and it could be you next, because this is this is a very slippery slope that we're on. But let's bring in Sean for the last few minutes, because we've been going for over 40 minutes actually. Warren, we could go on a lot longer actually, but it'd be really interesting. But let's bring Sean in and just sort of get some reaction from people.
Hello, hi. I've been ensconced in the chat room, so it's really difficult for me to hear what's going on in your conversations and concentrate on what's going on in the chat. So please excuse me if you've actually answered any of these questions. I just want to say a quick hello to some of our regulars here, Katie and On Any Sundry Mule, Jürgen, Kira, Atcha John. Good to see you all in the chat today, all having a good conversation about freedom of speech and about independent journalism. We've got a few questions for you. Yep. Katie asks, what independent journalists should I look out for and follow?
Independent journalists that you should look out for and follow, if you want to know what's going on in terms of civilians being targeted by Ukraine. There is a guy called Cafe Revolution who does a YouTube channel, and he highlights all the atrocities that are going on in the Donbass. There is Patrick Lancaster, who's very good. There's Gareth Ike. You can always come to the Frontline Army and come and see us all at the front line. There is Gareth Ike, who's very good. And there is also Richard Willett. He's very, very good. And a chap called Tony Gosling pretty much gets quite good stuff. But journalists on the ground, the likes of Patrick Lancaster, are very, very good. If you've not seen any of Anne-Laure Bonnell's stuff, she is a French journalist. I would suggest you go and check her stuff out, and you will have a completely different perspective on what happens.
Okay, thank you for that, Warren. On Any Sundry Mule asks, it says, Graham Phillips's coverage is great. Right from early on, he reviews the Georgian wars as well. I'm not familiar with Graham Phillips's work. Atcha John says, I'm finding people in Israel, especially like Mark Regev, is blatantly lying in the face of objective evidence. What's the reason for this? This is almost ubiquitous to their, and he didn't finish his sentence. But just to fill you in, John, Mark Regev was the ambassador in the UK back when all the anti-Semitism smears were invented against Jeremy Corbyn. And he was photographed having a meeting with the Jewish Labour Movement and Board of Deputies. And I believe that was when the plan was hatched to have this anti-Semitism smear campaign on Corbyn. There's lots of circumstantial evidence for that. I can't completely say 100% that is true, but the circumstantial evidence does show that that's where that's happened. And Mark Regev was the architect of that campaign. Warren, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, wherever there's a Zionist cause, you'll find that, gentleman. And I do separate Jewish people from Zionists, because there are many, many Jewish people out there who've lived in the Arab countries and even now still have enclaves where there's no trouble whatsoever. And you're also looking at the Jewish people who are protesting and being very badly subdued in Israel for that. And I get quite good updates and very, very glad that some people can manage to smuggle out videos, you know, and it really is quite terrible. And I think it's one of those things where you look at, you know, and you've had Jewish protests on the streets against the Zionist sort of enclaves that they have there. And I think it's very, very important that people separate Israel and Zionism away from proper, normal Orthodox Jew. It really is, because this didn't start until around about 1925, when they got their first army in there. Now, Lord Palmerston did it in 1840. He wanted greater control over Egypt and the Suez Canal. And then round about sort of the first Zionist was turned by a guy called Wiseman. And that was, you know, back in 1882, when you had Rishon LeZion. And of course, you had Rothschilds paying for people to go and settle there. And they chased off. There was only 3,000 Jewish Palestinians, or sorry, Jewish people there. And they chased 70,000 off the land. And they bought huge swathes of land around Jaffa. And then, of course, you had the 1885, where the term Zionism came from an Austrian writer. Then you had 1907, when the Liberal Party put out that secret document about the, you know, a place that they ought to be able to call their own. And then 1927, you had the meeting in Basel in Switzerland, where they very much pushed for their own state of Israel. And then, of course, we had the Balfour Declaration that came. That was in, you know, and then you had Lawrence of Arabia, of course, where they sat down with Wiseman, who was a massive Zionist at the time, and they sat down with Prince Hussein, and it was that the Arab nations would be allowed to self-govern as long as they had a state of Israel. So I think it's very important to sort of take the Orthodox Jewish people away from the modern sort of Zionist state of it. I call it a state of Israel rather than a Jewish homeland. And you hear this argument all the time, don't you, about, oh, it was God's chosen people many, many years ago, and this, that, and the other. Well, that's a bit like clearing Australia because you want to hand it back to the Aborigines. It's a really nonsense argument. People that lived there before 1920 got along absolutely fine. And, you know, Julia Hartley Brewer, who gave Chris such a hard time, really ought to look into the horrific things that we did as a British nation back then in the 1920s to the people that lived in Palestine. And we genuinely, all our decisions that we made then, we caused what is happening today, really.
Yeah, no, indeed. Britain's hands are deep in blood,
Yes.
not just there, but really all the way around the world. But yeah,
well,
I mean, I think
I just want to pay tribute to the journalists that have been on the ground in Gaza reporting.
Absolutely.
And they have literally been putting their lives on the line. And up till 3 hours ago, we know that there's been 39 journalists killed or murdered. And I believe strongly that they are taking them out on purpose because they don't want the Western world to see what's actually going on. And I think they are the real heroes in this whole thing, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't know what was going on. You know, very much like back in the Second World War, people didn't know what was going on in pogroms. You know, they had to go to the local cinema to find out news and things like that. This is the modern day, and thankfully they've got the technology to be able to get that news out to us, get those images out to us. And I think this is why, you know, the world is so shocked. And I just want us to remember those heroes, never forget them.
While we're on that subject, Sean, can I just also mention, because I lost a very good friend in Ukraine, a French French gentleman when they cluster bombed in 2015, when they cluster bombed a supermarket, the Ukrainian authorities, the Azov Battalion, and the aid workers who die, and how many UN aid workers have been killed there in Palestine, and have been slaughtered by this indiscriminate carpet bombing of, and they even hit the school, the UN school. I mean, it's just beyond any common sense to defend that sort of action. It's a war crime. That's it.
Absolutely.
So everybody, if you could like, share and subscribe, that would really help us. And in the meantime, you can follow Chris on X, or formerly Twitter, at Derby. Is it Derby Chris W?
That's it, Derby Chris W. Yeah.
And you can follow us on at Resistance TV Pod. And
Warren, well done. Just remind everybody what your Twitter handle is as well, if you could.
My Twitter handle is Thornton WA, capital T, capital W, 47373.
Thanks very much indeed for that.
I have put that in the chat. So
yeah, that's great. And we just need to make sure that we get that out as widely as possible, because we want to grow your audience as well, Warren, because you're doing some really crucially important work. Thank you so much, Warren, for taking the time to come and speak to us this evening. It's been a really interesting discussion. I'm sure the people that's watched it tonight have really found it fascinating. And obviously what we'll be doing is we'll be sharing this after tonight. So it's not just a live audience. We get a lot of people who watch it afterwards, as it were. And we also put this out as a podcast on a Friday as well, without the pictures. So just hear your voice. So that's great. Well, thank you anyway, again, Warren. And thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. Hopefully we'll be back next week, all being well, at the same time. So until then, 7 o'clock next Wednesday, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.
Thank you very much, man.